you from the Gospel of John in chapter 1, and I'm going to pick up in verse 9 and read through 14, and then we'll end with verse 16. So in case you're flipping over to it, John 1, 9 through 14 and 16. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. May God bless the reading and the hearing and the understanding of this scripture, and God's people said, Amen. So yesterday we woke up and it felt like that first Saturday of summer, right? We don't really have anywhere to be. We can take our time. We don't have to rush to swim team. And we did that first thing that every family does at some point. We did that first trip to the pool. We get to the pool, and it is hot, but the water is cold. And it's not long until my son, who is 8, does what he always does when we go to the pool, and he says, "Dad, throw me." Right? And so in past years, I can launch this kid across the pool, right? And he says, "Dad, throw me." And so I picked him up. And it was this first kind of realization of, I can't throw this kid like I used to. Y'all, he has grown 4 inches in the last year, and he is solid. So, I managed a couple of throws, and then I tweaked something in my neck, and then I had to be like, "Son, I can't throw you." I have to keep telling myself, "You're not old, you're not old, you're not old." Fast forward later on in the day, we got to meet our nephew, their cousin, for the first time, 3.5-month-old Conrad. And there's something about meeting a new baby for the first time, right? That it just, seeing my kids with Conrad, you always get that sense of you forget how little they used to be, right? And maybe it's that 2 experiences in a row of "Son, I can't throw you like I used to. And then seeing him with this baby and thinking about what he was like when he was a baby, or what his sister was like when she was a baby, and what it's like to go from 0 kids to 1 kid, and what that was like, and go from 1 kid to 2 kid. And then it was this flood of memories that makes me wonder, how much stuff have I forgotten? How many little interactions or things that they used to say, or just the normals of our family? It's amazing how the normals can change underneath your feet. That you can look up one day and you're just living in the trenches and getting through it, and A to B to C to D, and you get something "I can't throw you like I used to." Or to meet a new baby that makes you realize, I'm not living in that normal anymore. Or think about those normals you live, whether it's with your kids or whether it's some season of life in work or family, or whatever it might be. We all go through seasons of life where we feel like we're in the trenches and we're just in it. And then one day something kind of shocks us to step back and look and be like, I'm not living in that normal anymore. That thing I never thought I'd get through, I'm not in it anymore. In some ways, that's the story of all of our lives. Everyone goes through that. It is the process of working yourself into the groove of some normal that will not last forever. It feels like it's going to last forever, but that's the story of each one of our lives. That we find our way to make peace with a normal that will not always be our normal. Because eventually you'll get some new job offer, or you'll graduate and you'll move on to some new opportunity. Your kids are going to get older, and there's nothing you can do to stop that. We go through seasons where we make bad choices, or we learn lessons the hard way. We grow as people. We learn to cope and make sense of life. We lose, we grieve, and all through this process, the normal that we are living sometimes shifts beneath our feet, and we don't even realize it. It does not matter what normal you are in today. It will not last forever. Whatever is your now, whatever is your normal, is always, whether you realize it or not, running up against what is coming down the road. And you are left to live somewhere in the middle of what was and what might be, trying to live well as a follower of Jesus by reconciling the truth of where you were and where you're going, bringing together the truth of where you've been and what you hope for the future. You are every single day, whether you realize it, doing the work of reconciling from the middle. Bringing together an ever-changing life and the ever-changing normal in an ever-changing world. Now, I'll admit, this is incredibly big picture. Right? It feels like this idea of the changing normal lives so high above the stuff we have to figure out in the grind of everyday life, of getting kids where they need to go and somehow making it to the store and making it work at work. I used to personally hate sermons that felt so big and so overarching and so squishy. It felt like they didn't relate to real life at all. But I've come to realize something as I get older and hopefully wiser, is that if you lose some sense of the big picture, the big story that you're living, someone else will decide the big picture for you. If you lose sense of the big story that you're living, someone will decide that story for you. And it's easy to do in the everyday grind and demands of up close in the trenches life. It's easy to lose sight of yourself and where you've come from and where you want to go. But if you lose sight of the big picture, the big story, slowly but surely the grind and the demand of everyday life will be bent to the shape of working yourself to death to buy stuff you don't need. Or someone will decide that the big picture that really matters most is swallowing some politician's talking point. Or maybe it will just be getting through the day with enough energy to flop on the couch and scroll through whatever algorithm tells you to look at. But we as followers of Jesus, we keep our sight both on the demands of everyday up-close life, but we also keep track of the big story that all of us are a part of. We're in sort of week 2 of a 2-week gap between sermon series, and this whole year long, whenever we find ourselves in gaps, I'm doing a series that's called Where We Come From. Oops, no screens. Just pretend. All right. It's called Where We Come From, that looks at the Methodist tradition that over the course of a lot of years has put churches and communities all across the world and is the tradition to which Parkway belongs. Not all of you might call yourself a Methodist. There's a lot of words you might use to describe yourself before that. But it's good for us to know the tradition that we have a home in, whether it's a word you claim about yourself or not. And today I want to talk about the big picture that is present in everyday life. And I want to talk about grace, about what we're talking about when we talk about grace. Now, I was raised on a definition of grace, I wonder if you were too, that is this, that grace is a gift from God that you don't deserve. Has anybody else heard that definition of grace? Yeah, I would guess that a lot of us have. And it's not wrong, although I do have some questions about it. Because this is a really popular definition of grace, especially in this part of the world. And I get that in talking about a gift you don't deserve, they're really trying to say that you can't earn it, you can't be good enough. But I think it's a weird way to describe a gift. Because I think the definition of a gift is that you don't deserve it, right? Like you don't get a birthday gift based on how useful you have been this year, right? At least I hope not. When you give someone a gift, it's never really out of earn or deserve or the value of that person. I would hope that when you buy someone a gift, it comes out of the love that you have for that person, right? Or I want to see their face when they unwrap this. I want to share in that joy with that person. But even beyond that, even beyond my nitpicking, my other question about the gift is that usually when you give a gift, it's sort of a one and done thing. Here. You might get that Christmas present every year. You might get that birthday present every year. But a gift is, for the most part, a here you go sort of thing. If we apply that thinking back to grace, then it feels like grace is either something you have or you don't. Are there people just walking around out there who don't have God's grace? Do they have it and they're just not using it? And if they don't have it, how do they get it? Because you don't have to look very far, whether it's on the news or just go to Costco, one of my least favorite places on the face of the earth. It seems like there's a lot of people who aren't operating in the gear of grace, right? So how do they start? Do they have to go get it? Because if that's true, and they don't have it, it feels like we're back to earning and deserving. When we start to ask questions of these basic definition of grace, we can start to find that we're contradicting ourselves pretty quickly. So I would put to you that part of the gift that we get from the Methodist tradition is that it's easier to understand grace like we already understand the changing seasons of life. That in the same way that life is a process of reconciling the past and the future into one normal that continues to push us forward and on and on, grace is the working of God in your life that does the exact same thing. That it reconciles and makes sense where you've been and where you are and where you can go. Grace works in you and on you and through you, not simply as a here you go sort of thing. But grace is this lifelong process that day by day, yes by yes, grace by grace, you are shaped and formed, given the power to become who God created you to be. That in grace, you can slowly but surely grow into a you who is made to look like Jesus in thought and word and action. It is not a one-time gift. And it's not a you either have it or you don't. The grace that is at work in each of you, no matter who you are, was here before you got here, works in you now, and pushes you onwards into the possibilities of the future. Y'all, grace in the Methodist tradition is the work of your entire life. It is a lifelong process of reconciling and bringing together what was and is and what can be by the grace of God. That is, in some ways, what is happening in these verses in the first chapter of John's Gospel. In the beginning, the very first words of John's Gospel, John does not trace Jesus back to some manger on Christmas, doesn't even mention it. But John traces Jesus back to the beginning of all things. He calls Jesus the Word. And you may have heard those words where he writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things came into being through him. Skip a couple verses ahead, that's where we drop in. And John talks about how Jesus, the Word, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. I think it matters that we get Jesus was coming into the world. Now stick with me. I know none of you rolled out of bed and got the kids ready to hear a lesson about grammar, so I promise we won't stick here. But I think the phrasing of that was coming into the world quietly speaks to the longer process of this work. Think about it this way. If you cooked dinner and everything went according to recipe, according to plan, you would say, I made dinner. It's a matter of fact. But if you were missing something or you had to think on your feet, if you dropped something and had to start over, if you burned the bread, you would say, I was making dinner, but... If you were getting kids ready to leave the house and it all went completely smoothly, which to my knowledge has never happened in the history of kids, you would say, we left the house. Matter of fact. But when you can't find a shoe and somebody's hungry and you're wondering why you even try, you say, we were leaving, but... In the same way for John, if God wanted to draw near, to snap fingers and make everything right and be among people, and everyone else said, yeah, sure, sounds great, we'll do whatever you say, God, John might write, the true light came into the world. But when the world that he created did not know him, when he came to his own and they did not accept him, John writes, the true light was coming into the world, but the beginning of this story, of this process of grace, is not an overwhelming revival, but it is a resistance to it. Here, John wants you to know that the story of grace, of God's grace coming into the world, hits a snag, hits a complication. It's not just a point A to point B sort of thing. Because this grace that is moving and acting, it is rejected by the people it moves and acts among. And the work of grace is the reconciliation, the bringing together of what was in their past and what is in that moment and what can be. But some people say no to that. But the thing is, it's true of the people who say yes to it also. John writes, but to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. Think about that. The grace, when people respond to it, say yes to it, it doesn't say grace gave them powers and abilities and all the answers. It doesn't say grace gave you status and you're better and holier than thou. For all the things that we could talk about with what you get with grace, here from John's perspective, grace gives you the power to become something you are not yet. Grace gives you the power to become, with the grace of God, to be shaped and molded into some better version of yourself that looks and speaks and thinks like the gospel. And all of this change, this shaping, this forming, God does not do it from a distance, floating out there somewhere, but God does this up close. John writes, the Word became flesh and lived among us. Often the focus here is Word became flesh and that Jesus lived like you and me, but those words, and lived among us, literally in the Greek, it means, and God set up his tent near us. In other words, God became like us and moved into the neighborhood. And it is from that process of coming into the world and being rejected by the world and then coming and moving into the neighborhood. It is from this fullness that we have all received grace upon grace. Grace stacked on top of grace, stacked on top of grace. When John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Way, reads these words of John back in the 1720s and 30s, he goes on to write his own understanding of how this grace of God works, not as a here you go sort of thing, but as a process that is not simple. Over the centuries, Methodists have come to stack 3 layers of grace on top of each other, all rooted in this story of John. The first of those layers, Methodists call prevenient grace. Say that with me real quick. Prevenient grace. I always get people to say that with me because it's a very 1700s sort of word that nobody ever uses ever. But the idea behind it is that prevenient grace was here before you got here. This is a kind of grace that is always one step ahead of you. There is nowhere you can go that the grace of God has not yet already been. And there's nowhere you can want to go where the grace of God is not yet waiting for you. Prevenient grace is the belief that no matter who you are, the mistakes that you have made, the life you have lived, the grace of God, no matter what, has worked and moved and been present in your life from the very beginning. That's part of the reason that in the Methodist Church we baptize babies. Some churches will say, no, you have to get to a certain age and claim the faith for yourself. But part of the reason we baptize infants is the belief that even when you cannot feed yourself, clothe yourself, when you can do nothing for yourself, the grace of God is still at work in your life. Now, you might hear the grace of God is at work in everyone's life and go, then why have all these things happened in my life? Why have things not gone according to plan? Why has there been this pain and this struggle and this suffering? The grace that is at work in your life does not give you magic powers, and it does not guarantee you that your life will be easy and carefree. But that grace that is present in your life from the beginning, it is an openness. It is a capacity to recognize God moving, to grow in your faith, to grow to the point of recognizing what God has done for you and for all people. That capacity to grow in faith, for grace to recognize grace, is in itself a grace. Now, when you get to that moment, that aha moment of recognizing God, of saying yes to God's grace, then you stack that grace on grace. That second layer is called justifying grace. And this is that moment of recognition, of acceptance, that Christ lived and died and rose again and calls you, no matter who you are, to follow him with your life. We see this in John. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. And that's where the Methodist tradition departs from this, here you go, sort of understanding of grace. Because when you have that moment, whether that is on your own, whether it's in a community, whether it was when you were 12 years old at summer camp and you prayed the prayer the pastor told you to pray, when there's that moment of, I say yes to this grace of God, your work is not done. It is just entering a new phase. That final layer of grace upon grace upon grace is that power to become. It is called sanctifying grace in the Methodist tradition. It is that lifelong grace, that lifelong process that reconciles, that brings together your past and your present and pushes you on to new possibilities. That at no point are you good enough, smart enough about the Bible, have all the right words enough, where God says, you're doing great, I'm done with you. Sanctifying grace is what pushes you on from normal to normal to normal, that always pushes you forward, making you more like Christ. Sanctifying grace is that relationship with God that shapes you into who you were created to be and someone who looks like Jesus. Y'all, this grace upon grace upon grace, this is the big picture of our faith. This is the bigger story of grace, whether it is as narrow as your individual life, whether it's about the life of a community that chooses to live with each other, or if we're talking about what God desires for the life of the world. In all things, the grace of God works to reconcile us with the histories and the past and the mistakes and where we've come from. To meet us in the normals that we are used to, knowing that no normal stays our normal forever. And by the ways that grace works in our hearts and in our life, pushes us onwards to live into the possibilities that are closer to the image of the gospel of Jesus. What would change if we could keep our eyes on that bigger picture no matter what we go through? What if you knew going into whatever your week holds that the backdrop of your life was bigger than what's going on at work, or whatever election is coming up, or just trying to get through and escape the stress of life? But what if in all things you knew, whether in your life or in your community or in the world, that in all things God desires to work grace that reconciles all things into a normal past, present, future of grace? If that is the big picture that shapes the smaller parts of life, it'll start to show up. You might start to realize that if the goal is grace, then maybe not everything depends on getting that last word or proving that you were right. Maybe those are things that can end up getting in the way of grace rather than making things right. Or maybe in the ways grace pushes you, you find the strength to make a change. Maybe you can invest in your spirit. Maybe you can be still in a world that only gets faster. Or maybe grace can be simply deeper awareness of what's going on in your life and in the world that wants to profit off of your distraction. Whoever you are, and wherever you are in life and wherever you are in faith, the big picture of our lives is the reconciling work of grace, and that Christ has called each of you, in the grace that has been at work in your life from the beginning, to say yes to this work of grace, knowing that day by day yes by yes, grace by grace, we can our whole lives long be shaped as followers of Jesus and as people who depend on the grace of God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, alleluia and amen.